debate over whether Scotland should become independent could cause some other consequences for those Britons who live south and west of the Scottish border. People intending to vote yes in the referendum in Scotland later this year are hoping to see the Saltire as the sole ensign across the country. But what would that mean for the Union flag? The Flag Institute, that's the UK's national flag charity, polled its members and found that nearly 65% of respondents felt that the Union flag should be changed if Scotland become independent. And after the poll, the organisation was flooded with suggested replacements for the flag. The issue of which flag to unfurl, of course, is not just restricted to Scotland. In Crimea, at the moment, Ukrainian and national flags, as well as others, are being waved, run up and down flagpoles and used as crucial symbols of identity. Flags were also motifs waved in squares across the Arab world during the Arab Spring. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Prime Minister John Key has just announced that there would be a referendum within 3 years on whether to maintain the current New Zealand flag. Of course, along with several Commonwealth nations, in its corner is the Union Jack. Mr. Key would like to see this change. So how significant is a flag? What of the British Union flag in an independent Scotland? How and why is it so closely entwined with identity, patriotism? And can it also be seen as a symbol of oppression? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Graham Bartram. He is the chief vexillologist at the Flag Institute. Of course, vexillology, for those who don't know, is the study of flags. Also here in the studio is David Vineswhite, who is the Somerset Herald of Arms in Ordinary at the College of Arms in London. And also here is Professor Paul Ward. He's the head of Department of History and English Languages and Media at the University of Huddersfield. He's also written a number of books on Britishness, patriotism, including Red Flag and Union Jack and Britishness since 1870. And on the line from Belfast is Liam Clark. He's the political editor of the Belfast Telegraph. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Graham Bartram, I'd like to start with you. What did your respondents say when faced with the prospect of Scotland voting yes in a referendum? They consider that the Union flag needs to change.
Well, they felt that given that the background colour of the Union flag is blue, and it's blue because that's Scotland, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a blue background when the national flags of the remaining parts have no blue in them. So they probably want a new flag. That's not to say that the Union flag itself would actually disappear, because the Union flag came into existence before we had a United Kingdom. It came into existence in 1606. We didn't have any form of United Kingdom until 1707. So the flag itself may actually still exist, maybe for use on royal warships, which is what it originally came into being to do.
But it would very much take a back seat.
Oh, yes,
it would be
yes,
it would become a minor flag. What is now a global icon would become a minor flag.
It would probably go back to just being a jack, yes.
What are some of the alternatives being proposed? I mean, you're being sent some kinds of proposals. I mean, I guess there are sensible ones and less sensible ones.
People are looking at all the different symbols of England, Wales and Northern Ireland and working out which bits aren't represented. So, for instance, Wales at present isn't represented in the Union flag at all because it's considered to be part of England. So if Scotland leaves, maybe it's time for Wales to get a representation. Maybe change the background colour to green. Some people have suggested putting red dragons on it. Other people have gone for the Welsh Christian flag, which is St David's flag, which is a gold cross on a black background, and suggested maybe a black background with gold around one of the crosses. So a whole range of different ideas. Those are the, shall I say, the more in-field ones.
The more in-field ones. I mean, what do you think about that, David?
If the union with Scotland did end, I mean, Graham is quite right. There's no reason for why the Union Jack should cease to exist, but whether it would be the national flag of the United Kingdom, obviously that would be a matter for political decision for ministers at the time. But there are plenty of examples in the world of flags and heraldry where things have stayed long after their political sense went. So, for example, in the Queen's coat of arms, the Irish harp appears, although the Queen makes no claim to be Queen of Southern Ireland. The royal arms have never been changed to reflect Irish independence. So it's quite possible to think it might annoy an independent Scotland that with a rump United Kingdom could go on using the flag. That is a political decision rather than an heraldic or flag maker's decision. I
mean, do you see it as a sensible, serious debate that should Scotland become independent, and this is a big if, this is an unforeseen consequence of that, and something that is intrinsic to British heritage may change?
Well, I mean, flags are historically specific, and I think we can recognise changes across the centuries by changes in flags. And I think from that point of view, a change in Scotland would mark a historic moment. I think the idea of continuity is very important because it also marks that sense that despite the symbols changing, somehow the underlying sentiments will remain. And I think it's clearly the case in Scotland that even if it became independent, that there would be a substantial number of the population who still considered themselves to be British and would probably, for the first few years, continue to fly a Union flag in some way. I think we'd see them as bumper stickers, we'd see them in windows and so on.
And one's assuming that if Scotland gets independence, that's it, and there isn't then a union movement which is strong in the remaining part of the United Kingdom and still in Scotland. An independence vote might not settle it politically.
There is a vague possibility that if Scotland became independent, you might actually see more Union flags in Scotland, simply because people would actually want to indicate that they were on that side of the argument as opposed to the nationalist side of the argument. So whereas at present you hardly ever see a Union flag north of Gretna Green, you might actually start to see them again.
And so it becomes a kind of de facto symbol of kind of rebellion in a way.
Not so much rebellion, but maybe allegiance to another cause. For instance, if you go to Western Canada, you'll quite often see Union flags, quite often old Union flags, that's without the red diagonals, flying from shops and premises there. And it's all to do with their identity as British Canadians as opposed to French Canadians.
And I suppose also, Graham Buttram, that these flags don't ever die. I mean, I've been to Georgia a few times, and Georgia has the Cross of St. George in its flag, but actually the flag has changed twice since independence, and those who believe that, who kind of hark back to days of yore, use the old Georgian flag. Those who sort of more pro-European tend to use the new one. Those old flags, they still stay around, don't they?
Oh, absolutely, and sometimes they come back. For instance, if you look at the flag of Libya, the modern flag of Libya is actually the flag of the Kingdom of Libya before Gaddafi. So that flag disappeared and was then brought back. And actually, if you look around a lot of countries that have had second revolutions, if you like, quite often they go back to an older flag. So Georgia, for instance, the current flag of Georgia dates back to, I think, the 16th century, if not earlier. It's a very old flag, and they chose that to represent their new country. Russia's flag, look what happened with Russia. Russia went back to its pre-Soviet flag, a flag that dates back to the 1700s.
And with Pan-Slavic colours, it's a flag that's repeated in several other countries. Liam Clark in Belfast, I guess the flag in Northern Ireland, it's an understatement to say it's an emotive topic. How would they feel about a change of the Union flag should Scotland leave?
As you say, these things are argued very, very tightly in Northern Ireland. It would be a major shock to the system if Scotland became independent here, because the Unionist population generally trace their ancestry to Scotland and feel loyal to it. However, it hadn't struck me that they would have to drop the Union flag, because I think the Scottish independence movement are suggesting still retaining the monarchy, though they would have separate parliaments and a lot of legislative independence. I think Alex Salmond is saying we'd keep the Queen as the head of state. Here, all this is really understood along religious lines. In Northern Ireland, you have a situation where in opinion polls, only maybe 20-25% of people say they would favour a united Ireland, yet nationalist parties get almost half the votes. And it's really a tribal contest. They don't want the Unionists or the Protestants to have a completely free rule, so they need an opposition force. Things like, I was interested to see the harp being mentioned, because the harp is basically accepted as a symbol by unionism here. It was in the crest of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It's in the Irish Rangers crest, a harp and crown, and indeed the Northern Ireland flag, the official Northern Ireland flag, has a provincial symbol of a red hand, but that's looked on by nationalists as a unionist symbol, because the unionist paramilitary took it up. It gets very, very complicated here, and we had months of protest when they reduced the flying of the Union flag on Belfast City Hall last year. The issue still isn't solved, but it actually paralysed the place every Saturday for months.
It still seems to divide many, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely divides. It was Belfast was the big one. Belfast had been a majority unionist city for quite a long time, and during that period, there was no dispute that the Union flag flew every day. Then when nationalists got near parity, they wanted to remove it every day, and the Alliance Party, a centrist group, they proposed flying it on 18 designated days, which the nationalists accepted, but the unionists took as a complete erosion of their identity. And there were mass protests about it. I remember I asked the Royal College of Arms what their view was at the time, and they said that they regarded this constant flag flying as basically an American, more of an imported idea. It wasn't really normal in the UK, and the designated day is regarded as a way to keep it special. But that's not how Unionist hardliners saw it in Northern Ireland. They took it every day just to show we're still in the UK and the border hasn't been removed.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the future of the Union flag if Scotland were to vote for independence. Joining me in the studio is Graham Bartram, the chief vexillologist at the Flag Institute, David Vines-White, the Somerset Herald of Arms in Ordinary at the College of Arms in London, and Paul Ward, author of the book Red Flag in Union Jack and Britishness since 1870. And on the line, Liam Clark, the political editor of the Belfast Telegraph. David White, is interesting, an American tradition imported.
I would argue that confident people and countries don't get terribly worked up about their flags. It's when national identity or national confidence is contested in some way that people jump to fly the flags. And we may think of America as a great confident power, but there are all sorts of sort of underlying insecurities there, which date back to America's early days in its relationship with Britain. If you go to Norway, a comparatively new country, started in 1905, every garden in the country has got a flagpole with the flag flying. Whether it actually looks nice across the Norwegian landscape is a matter of taste. But there is a strange sort of lack of confidence. Britain, in its great days as an imperial power, didn't make much use of its flag in the British Isles. It did where things were contested, where you had to establish that a fort was British or a ship was British abroad. But within Britain, the flying of the flag until very recently was quite restrained. And we used to have this notion of red letter days when specific royal birthdays and other commemorative events, the flag would be flown. And those went under Gordon Brown, strangely, or perhaps not coincidentally, a man who was very worried that the English saw him as not British enough and too Scottish, I think.
And speaking of the American side of things, there was an interesting experiment conducted by a social psychology professor at the University of Nevada who actually found that that the red, white and blue didn't actually increase feelings of patriotism. It tended to make people more nationalistic. We tend to view it as a badge of patriotism, but perhaps it's a bit less than that.
One interesting thing which has happened comparatively recently, if you think back to Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee, Margaret Thatcher, they never addressed the nation in front of the British flag, but modern prime ministers do, and that is something which has been imported from America.
I think I'd dispute that a little bit, because there is the famous picture of Margaret Thatcher in a chieftain tank with the Union Jack flying, and at times of sort of imperial triumph.
Yes, I'll grant you that. That was a good photo opportunity, but she didn't have press conferences with the flag furled behind her, which is something.
Yeah. So what's changed then? What's changed now, Paul?
I think. I mean, in some ways, that desire for the left to take up patriotism in Britain is quite powerful. So even the current Labour Party under Ed Miliband is looking at Englishness in the face of Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism. But there's also just that sense that people want to feel that they belong, and then therefore using the flag, if there's any question of them belonging, becomes quite important to them. So the Labour Party has wrapped itself in the Union Jack across the 20th century, and other Britons, new Britons, have tried to ensure that they get a chance to use the flag and to reject notions that there ain't no black in the Union Jack, as the saying went in the 1970s from the far right. So some people want to take up the flag as evidence of their belonging. Flags are political. They give people a sense of political identity. And where that political identity is at threat, flags are often used more often than when people take it for granted that being British is forever and eternal.
So it fosters a sense of identity then, Graham?
Absolutely. I think the Britain of the 1950s and before was basically a homologous state. Everyone in the country was the same race. They spoke the same language. They pretty well looked the same. They spoke very differently, of course, because we all had our strange dialects and accents. But we were obviously connected. Now we're having to do what the Americans did, which is why they use their flag, which is nation building. You now have to take a disparate group of people and create a nation out of it. And as you were saying, people are using the flag. The flag is probably the only symbol that you can use for this purpose, to indicate they belong to the nation. So just because they don't look like your average white Anglo-Saxon Protestant doesn't mean they're not British. And they can show that by having a relationship with the flag. And this is why the flag is so important in America, because they were, a melting pot nation. They are made up of all the peoples of Europe, plus the Native Americans, plus the South Americans. They're all brought together in America. And therefore they had to create a country using just symbols.
I would dispute that, but then I'm an academic and a historian, so I always dispute everything. That Britain was never actually that united, that Jewish migration and Irish migration in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century actually meant that there were always groups who were looking for belonging. And in the First World War, with the centenary of the First World War this year, sort of the Jewish Lads Brigade joined en masse to the British Army. So you get that use of the flag. There's a Glaswegian boxer, a Jewish boxer who fought with a Star of David on one leg and a Union Jack on the other leg of his shorts. So in some ways, this the idea of symbols being contested and identities being claimed is a part of British history, and I think we overestimate the extent of change that we're necessarily going through at the moment.
America's made a great fetish of its flag, partly because it doesn't have a crown, it doesn't have a monarchy, it doesn't have a language which it can claim its own. So there are other symbols and other things that one can attach oneself to, and speaking English and knowing about the English, the British landscape, and knowing about having a relationship to the crown is also an aspect of showing one is British and feeling British.
Liam, what about where you are? I mean, those who want a united Ireland, how do they feel about seeing the Union Jack? Is it one of antipathy?
Yes, well, it is sometimes used as a tribal thing. I mean, you get quite a lot of Catholics who have traditionally been nationalist community who will say in opinion polls, and if they're talking to you, well, we'd rather remain in the UK, we think we're financially better off, but it'll be a reasoned argument. It won't be a deep loyalty that you would find amongst the Unionists, and you find it in Unionist areas, working class areas, particularly poor areas where there's a sense of insecurity. You'll see a lot of Union flags up. You'll see paving stones or the curbstones being painted red, white and blue, and that's echoed to some extent, but not as much in nationalist areas. So it's a sign of, it's used to mark territory, it's used to express solidarity in the face of a perceived threat, that sort of thing. I think, I'd be interested in the experts, I think that is pretty much intrinsic to flags. I mean, flags are used in battle, people rally to the colours and so on, so there is that element to them. But I just noticed a confident society. I was struck by what David Vine White said about insecurity. I mean, it just came back to me that the flag of Hawaii, which has long been a part of the US, has a Union flag in the corner because of their past association with the British Empire, and presumably that's because people in Hawaii feel quite secure in their identity. They've no doubt that they're Americans more than anything else, and they don't look on it that there's a threat of Britain invading or anything like that. They can cherish their heritage.
And actually, that was the one question I got wrong in that Guardian quiz that I did take today. That I was really thrown by the idea of a British flag in the Hawaiian flag.
In the Hawaiian flag, yes. Which is a great riposte to those in Australia and New Zealand who complain about their Union flag. If you want to make it, I mean, it is strange.
Well, the weird thing about Hawaii is it was never part of the British Empire. That's not why it has a Union flag in the corner.
Yes.
It has a Union flag in the corner because Cook gave the King of Hawaii a British flag, or rather an ensign, and the King of Hawaii liked it so much. They didn't have flags before Cook gave him this one, that he said this would be the flag of Hawaii. And so that's why it has a Union flag in the corner. And the really strange thing is Cook gave them the flag before 1801. And when we changed our flag in 1801, Hawaii changed its flag too. So
they're hanging on to it for dear life. While we're on the subject of Captain Cook, he discovered my homeland of New Zealand, and the Prime Minister, John Key, has made the point that he wants a referendum on whether to change the national flag within 3 years. Now, his comment, actually, I'll go to you, Paul. I'd be interested in your take on this. His quote was that the flag remains dominated by the Union Jack in a way that we ourselves are no longer dominated by the United Kingdom. He kind of sees it as an aspect of colonialism, which has long been thrown off Obviously, Australia, many other Commonwealth countries probably feel the same. What do you think about that?
Well, of course, lots of people migrated to New Zealand because they wanted to establish a better Britain, and they saw it as a way of building the home life elsewhere, and I think that applies to lots of parts of the British Empire. What's surprising, really, is just how long it's taken to throw off the British embrace. It's quite surprising that 50 years after Canada decided to get rid of the Union flag from its flag and went for the maple leaf, that Australia and New Zealand have maintained it. Now, in some ways, that's because of changes in the way those countries are run, a recognition of different cultures, a recognition of different histories, and that in some ways the British part of their history is tainted by atrocities, by sort of cultural wars against the original inhabitants. And it does make it feel that it's time for change when the flag doesn't really represent all of the histories of a country.
Liam, can I just get your take on that? I mean, I wouldn't expect you to comment on necessarily on the New Zealand situation, but it is interesting that the Prime Minister there said that the flag in New Zealand shows British dominance. I guess a lot of people in Northern Ireland probably feel the same way about the Union Jack.
Well, I think it's seen as British dominance, but also as a symbol of Unionist rule. Unionists ruled Northern Ireland with a majority government for the first 50 years of the state's existence, and that leaves a fairly sour taste with many Catholics and nationalists. So it's maybe more in tribal terms. Now, certainly in the Irish Republic, it wouldn't have been possible until relatively recent years to have displayed the Union flag. I mean, since the Queen's visit, City of Cork turned into a sea of Union flags when Queen Elizabeth visited it. But for many years, I grew up in the Republic myself. I mean, if somebody had put up a magazine with a Union flag in the window, I mean, I remember the window being smashed. I mean, there was that association with colonialism. There was a chip on our shoulder. We weren't quite an independent country yet. But as Ireland has become more confident in its independence, then that hang-up has tended to go. So I think flags, there's a deep link with insecurity there.
And Liam, I mean, we're 2 years before the centenary of the Easter Uprising. I mean, do you think these symbols of flags will become ever more prominent in 2016?
Well, I think 2016, it's hard to say, but I think it'll go off fairly smoothly. I mean, relations between the Irish Republic and Britain have really never been better in the history of the Republic. They're very close in terms of trade and cooperation and loans and cooperation in power supply, cooperation in Northern Ireland. So I think it will probably go off more as an historic event. I think Republican dissidents, which are quite a small group in Northern Ireland, will try to do something dramatic on 2016 if they can manage it.
Graham, some of the opposition to changing the New Zealand flag is that this in fact was the flag that New Zealanders died under during 2 world wars, and of course some Anzac troops were key in the First World War. At the moment, only 28% of people want to see the flag changed. How do you see it playing out? What do you make of the arguments being made there?
Well, I noticed that the Prime Minister in his speech made the point that the flag wouldn't change before the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings. So he's obviously timed it so as not to run into that particular hurdle. It's always the problem if you want to change your national flag, that, as you say, people have died for it. So changing it becomes a very emotive subject.
There's quite a bit of myth-making, certainly in Australia, and I think also in New Zealand. Australian Imperial Force and all the Anzacs and all the Canadians and the Indians, they were fighting under the Union flag, and it's a modern projection back to give a sort of national resonance to what has now became in 52 or 53 the Australian flag, to say that was a national flag, and with a slight rewriting of history there. But it's a very emotive argument.
But it's certainly no affront, I suppose, to national identity. I mean, as you mentioned with the harp, the Irish link behind the royal flag there, these things can take on new significance over time, and we can perhaps forget about the fact that, well, at one point it was a colony.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the Australian and New Zealand flags and Britain's remaining colonies, they've followed exactly the same pattern, with, in heraldic terms, the Union Jack in the senior, most important part of the flag. But that can take on a new meaning for a different time.
Talking of the anniversary of the Irish Rebellion, one of the strange things that would be worth looking at is the red hand emblem is in fact the emblem of the Irish Citizens' Army, the very people who stormed the post office. On their uniforms was the Red Hand of Ulster.
The Red Hand's a very old symbol. It's actually goes back to Gaelic Ireland, where a chieftain was claiming territory, and it was a race in boats, and whoever could touch the shore would get Ulster first, and one cut off his hand and threw it with the shout, Lam Darragaboo, the Red Hand forever. And he got the land. So it's used by GAA teams, it's been used by the Irish Citizen Army, but I think it's a bit tainted for nationalists now because it's also been used by a loyalist paramilitary terrorist group called the Red Hand Commando, so it tends to have that association, though, as you say, it's a far more ancient association with Gaelic Ireland before there was the British or the Normans or the Scots-Irish had arrived.
Graham, what should a good flag have? What constitutes a really good, effective flag?
One that people can identify with, and one that they can draw is a good point. Sometimes new flags are so complicated that if you actually asked a school child to draw their national flag, they'd not be able to, or at least not be able to draw something that was recognisably their national flag.
So Japan would be a good flag.
Japan would be an excellent flag.
The Union Jack is pretty easy to draw.
The Union Jack is an excellent flag because it's so unique. In terms of how easy it is to draw, it's a nightmare to draw properly.
Well, to do it properly, but you can do a good child's sketch of the Union Jack.
You need children to be able to draw lines at 36.27 degrees and things in order to get the actual lines right. But try and keep the number of colours low. Although, having said that, of course, one of the most successful flags in modern history is South Africa. It breaks all the rules about flag design.
Why does it break the rules?
It's got far too many colours. But they've made a plus out of a minus. But they call themselves the Rainbow Nation. They have the rainbow flag, they have the Rainbow Nation.
But all you need is for another country to put in a lot of colours into its flag in that pattern, and then you've got confusion.
Yes,
I mean, the comparatively few flags in the world don't look like somebody else's. Britain is very lucky in having a flag that doesn't look like somebody else's. Australia and New Zealand look like each other. I mean, Chad and Romania are essentially the same, I think. But, but fortunately, Chad and Romania don't have a land border, so no problem arises.
In fact, I seem to remember there was a poll they did a vox pop in New Zealand and asked people to identify either the Australian or the New Zealand flag, and quite a few of the New Zealanders, I mean like 30 or 40%, couldn't tell which one was which.
Oh, goodness me. That's
one of the reasons why they might be thinking of changing it.
That's a shaming statistic. Paul, you mentioned the Canadian flag changed very relatively recently, 1965. It's now an iconic flag that virtually everybody can recognise. So these flags can take on quite significance and be recognisable internationally very, very quickly, it seems.
Well, absolutely, but I think it's part of a sense of identity and history developing over the future, because lots of flags, I presume, have been designed and have disappeared because they don't get that purchase. Now, that would be the problem with any new design for a Union flag, that people would have to take up the design for it. It would have to start to make sense to them, and actually that's quite difficult to know how it would happen. My guess is that people would revert more and more to their national flags, and as in England and Wales, as a way forward, rather than take up a new flag. I would say the other problem is that in the old days, you had to design a flag if you're a child with a pen and pencil or colouring pencils. These days you can do it digitally, and it's certainly the case that you see just remarkable designs that people have done. But that's sort of the changed nature of our world. I remember as a child, and I'm not that old, but I remember as a child using encyclopedias to learn flags. And when I look at those encyclopedias in my parents' house now, all the flags have changed. And not quite all
have changed.
But there's an awful lot more of them too.
Yeah, there's a lot of new flags. Now they take on purchase according to how countries develop and how they develop their sense of history. And actually, often they do refer back to a more distant past. They draw on something that sort of ignores the most recent period of history that's seen them dominated by someone else.
Liam, I'll leave the final word with you.
Because the Scots are wanting to stay under the crown, then it would be United Kingdom. Here in Northern Ireland, I don't think there'll be any easy answers to it. There was an American diplomat, Richard Haas, suggested we have our own flag. A lot of designs come up, an Irish flag with a crown in the middle, a green Union Jack, and so on, but not a single political party bought into any of them. They just divided along the old lines.
That's all we've got time for. I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests. That's Liam Clark on the line from Belfast. He's the political editor of the Belfast Telegraph. And here in the studio, Graham Bartram, chief vexillologist at the Flag Institute, Professor Paul Ward, who's the head of History, English, Languages and Media at the University of Huddersfield, and David Vines-White, the Somerset Herald of Arms and Ordinary at the College of Arms in London. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.